Cynthia Tuck. I am the Director of Development at Cornell Atkinson, and I am simply here just to welcome you and give you a quick 2-second blurb about what Cornell Atkinson is. The Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability is a mission-driven organization within Cornell where we're really trying to drive the knowledge of Cornell's amazing academic enterprise to impact outside of the academy in the real world. So you will hear a bunch about that in our presentation. And I'm going to hand it over to Ben Furness, who's the Executive Director of the 2030 Project, which is Cornell's climate initiative. And then we're going to hear from a wonderful panelist of faculty. If you could all make sure to sign in, we have a sign-in sheet at the front, and please feel free to help yourselves to pastry and coffee throughout the presentation. We're a pretty casual group, so don't be shy about getting up in the middle of the talk. Thank you, and here's Ben.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to come up to the podium. And I'll actually have our panelists can come up and sit down. So my name is Ben Furness. I'm the Executive Director of the 2030 Project, a university-wide climate research initiative based out of the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability. And we're here this morning to talk about Cornell's work to accelerate a technology colloquially known, it's a little bit of a mouthful, as carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And so I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about the landscape of this technology, why we sort of see it as an interesting tool in the toolkit to address the threat of global climate change, and talk a little bit about the work that's happening among our faculty to accelerate innovation. So to get started, a little bit about the 2030 Project. This was a university-wide climate research initiative launched 2 years ago to support and accelerate impact-oriented climate work across all of Cornell's diverse colleges and units. We're based out of the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability, not affiliated with any individual college, so it means we can support great work that's happening anywhere across Cornell. We have 4 themes that we use to organize our work and think about the ways in which we can be addressing the challenge of global climate change. One, as you all know, we have a very active set of folks thinking about food and farms, the way humanity eats in the future, how we can both be preparing our food systems for the changes to come, and how we can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, the climate pollution associated with our food systems, and how we can think about getting farmers in on the game of being part of the climate solution. We're also thinking about the future of our energy systems, where the energy comes from, the electricity that we use when we turn on our lights or drive around in our vehicles, from electricity to heating to transportation. We're thinking about ways of what the next generation of energy will look like and how we can be a part of the solution. We also think about the materials of the future, so all of the different physical objects that we use, how they're produced, and thinking about ways in which new materials can help us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and prepare for the changes to come. We also work very closely with a whole range of social scientists and other types of policy and labor experts, thinking about the societies of the future, the policies, business, and movements that will help us address the challenge of global climate change. This set of folks here and a lot of the carbon capture and utilization work fits fairly comfortably in the materials of the future box. So we're thinking about new materials and new ways of making things that will help to either capture greenhouse gas emissions, reduce the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the production of all the things that make up our material lives, and how we can reduce the impacts of a decarbonized world. To start out, I'll talk a little bit about the magnitude of the challenge. Across the world, about 2/3 or 3/4 of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the production of various types of energy to make things, to do things, to get around, to keep our interiors comfortable. And another major set comes from various types of chemical processes that are involved in the making of certain things, particularly steel, concrete, other types of plastics. So the name of the game in addressing global climate change, which threatens all of us in various ways, but particularly affects the most vulnerable people on the planet, is to do a combination of things. One is to dramatically reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that humanity generates, and also it means removing greenhouse gas emissions that have accumulated in the atmosphere and that are contributing to global climate change. So this graph sort of articulates the pretty classic way of talking about this challenge. We need to dramatically reduce the greenhouse gas emissions associated with a lot of the way we operate as a species, and then remove historical greenhouse gas emissions that have accumulated in the atmosphere. The target that at least has been articulated by the International Panel on Climate Change and others is that by the year 2050 we'll ideally be removing 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide or its equivalents every year from the atmosphere. Now that's a huge amount. It's more than most materials we have on the planet. And to give you a sense of the gigaton scale we're talking about, 1 kiloton, so 1,000 tons, is about the mass of 500 cars. 1 million tons, 1 megaton, is about the size of the Great Pyramid of Giza. And 1 gigaton is this big rectangular prism stuck on top of a city, and you're like, what? I have no sense of the scale of that. But this little vertical spike, this little sliver right there, that is the Washington Monument. So we're talking about a huge amount of material that we'll need to be removing from the atmosphere and reducing from the pollution that is generated by all the ways in which we produce our stuff and use energy and get around. This is a really both challenging time because of the daunting scale of the problem, but also an incredibly exciting time in both the United States of America and the world. In the past couple of years, there's been a huge amount of new federal legislation designed to make major investments in all sorts of decarbonization technologies, but including carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So capturing greenhouse gas emissions and using that carbon both in products or storing it underground to keep it from heating the planet. The three major laws that people will often talk about in this context are the CHIPS and Science Act, passed in 2022, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, passed in 2021, the Inflation Reduction Act, which also passed in 2022. And these bills in combination helped and are helping to accelerate both research and development into all of these things, helping companies adopt these new technologies and accelerating them across, integrating into brand new ways of doing things. So you sort of see all the way on the left here, research and development. There's resources available for that, for companies to adopt these new practices, for consumers to adopt these new technologies and to expand them into the marketplace. So we at Cornell are thinking about how we can position our experts and our researchers to both, be at the cutting edge of the new technologies that are being developed, but also how we can position ourselves to help these social transformations that are happening across the public and the private sectors. And these projects are sprouting up all over the place. So this is a map showing projects where there's both carbon removal, so removing greenhouse gases directly from the atmosphere, or different types of carbon capture projects which are capturing carbon or other greenhouse gases from ongoing operational industrial plants. So you see a huge amount of new projects being invested in direct air capture, power generation, industrials with the making of different products, and storing these greenhouse gases under the ground in geologic storage. There's a lot more to say about any one of these projects, but just to give you a sense of the scale of transformation that's happening as we speak and how we're thinking about positioning Cornell's researchers to take advantage of this really exciting and important moment. So now to hear a little bit about how Cornell is helping to meet this challenge, I want to talk a little bit about a new project that we have recently invested in, and I'm going to turn it over to Professor Phil Milner, who will talk a little bit about a project that we recently funded with some resources as part of something we called the Climate Solutions Fund. So we supported a wide range of impact-oriented projects from nearly $1.5 million we raised from the Dead & Co., so the Grateful Dead came to Cornell University's campus to relive the glory of their 1977 Barton Hall show. I had a religious experience at the concert, and it's also been a lot of fun to think about how to use those resources to help accelerate the great work that's happening across Cornell. One of the things that we invested in is some new facilities to help this great work happen, and I'll turn it over to Phil to talk a little bit about that. Phil, you want to take it?
Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm Professor Phil Milner from chemistry. I'm going to tell you a little bit about a really exciting project that we're going to get off the ground here called the Capture Lab. So, it's been mentioned about 2/3 of all global greenhouse gas emissions come from the combustion of fossil fuels for things like energy production or to make electricity. And so, if you look at projections for what we can do about that, like how we can prevent climate change from occurring on a massive scale, we have to do carbon capture from these power plants. We can't switch over quickly enough to solar and wind and other sustainable fuel sources. We have to do post-combustion carbon capture, it's called. And so what we need to do is design new types of materials or catalysts that can capture that CO2, that can convert it into useful chemicals. But there's a lot of contaminants in these emissions from power plants, and so sometimes it can be really difficult to test if your material can work well with those actual gas. It's very hard to get your hands on it. You can imagine trying to negotiate with oil or gas companies to try to get samples of their flue gas. So we have a really unique resource here at Cornell. Cornell is powered by a natural gas-fired power plant, and they have given us samples of their flue gas in the past, so we've tested it with new materials we've developed in our lab. And that gave us this great idea, why don't we make this a sort of permanent testing station? We could put a trailer right next to the power plant, and anybody across the world could come and bring their sorbents or their materials or catalysts and test them on actual flue gas with no strings attached, really. And so that led us to propose this to the Climate Solution Fund, and we have gotten this supported now, and so we're going to try to put this together and make this is really a unique resource. No other university in the US has something like this, that we can allow people to actually test out their new materials with actual emissions from our power plant. So we're really excited about the directions that this could enable. And again, this is something that no other university really has. I think not even in the US, but maybe in the world, nobody has this. So I think it really fits perfectly into Cornell's view of trying to make the university a living laboratory to actually do experiments with our power plant. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Phil. Next, I'd love to hear a little bit about the work of Professor Grishma Gadikoda. Grishma, do you want to talk a little bit about your work and how it fits into this big picture? Thanks.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for being here this afternoon. It's really a pleasure. Warm thanks to Cornell Atkinson for putting this event together. And I have many reasons to be grateful to Cornell Atkinson beyond just this event. They've actually helped seed some important projects in the area of CO2 capture and conversion, which have really helped us develop some solutions, including high-impact solutions that we're looking to scale. So this afternoon, I'm going to take some time to talk about how that came to be and the kind of impact that we're having in the world around us today. So I've been at Cornell about 5 years now, and when I first came in, there was a fund called the RRF Fund, and we were able to secure some funds, and through that we were able to raise some money from Department of Energy to the order of close to $5 to $10 million at this point in time. And what that has really helped us to do is to develop energy efficient CO2 capture and conversion solutions. So what we mean by that is we're actually taking CO2 and we're converting that into high-value products. High-value products that we can integrate into construction materials that we can so in that case. So I guess, can you all hear me in the back?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we'll take it.
Yes.
So great, you can all hear me in the back now? Okay, perfect. Is that better?
Yes.
Oh, perfect. Great. You're getting closer and closer to what it really needs to be, right? Yeah, so like I was saying earlier, it's really been a pleasure being here at Cornell and being able to develop technologies at the lab scale, having graduate students and postdocs actually develop these solutions, go through the patenting process, and actually work with industry partners in trying to get these solutions to scale. So one of those solutions has been being able to take CO2 and turn it into inorganic carbonates like calcium and magnesium carbonates in very energy efficient pathways. And what this allows us to do is to actually make sustainable cements. We're now able to reduce the carbon footprint of cement anywhere. Our estimate is that conservatively, we can reduce the CO2 footprint of cements by 30 to 40% using some of our technologies, which is quite significant. So we're now working with several industry partners here in the US in helping decarbonize the cement industry. Another example is also... Yes, yes. Another example is how we're helping decarbonize the iron and steel industry. So we recently received grants from ARPA-E to reduce the CO2 emissions from iron and steel making, but also capture those hard to abate CO2 emissions. So one example is how we are using ammonia as a reducing agent as opposed to coke or other carbon-based resources for producing that reduced iron oxide. But then for some of these hard to abate CO2 emissions, we have technologies for capturing the CO2 and converting it into carbonates. So now we can take these carbonates and then supply them into the cement industry. So it's taken us quite a bit of R&D in the lab, quite a few graduate students whose theses have basically contributed to this technology development. If there was somebody from Cornell Technology Licensing here, I would happily acknowledge them, but they've been really instrumental in helping us license this technology. So there's a startup that came about from this effort. It's called Carbon to Stone. They've raised close to $2 million in non-dilutive funds from DOE just to get this technology across from the valley of death and into translation. So we've really been incredibly grateful to Cornell as well as our industry partners in helping us manage CO2 emissions from very, very hard to abate sectors. Our conservative estimate is that electrification, particularly using renewable energy resources, will really help cut down CO2 emissions, but then there's going to be the CO2 emissions from hard to abate sectors. So our technologies are intended to help manage those emissions as well. And so if you have any questions, or if you have any follow-on comments, if you'd like to learn more about our technologies, just feel free to drop me a note and happy to share more details to that effect. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you everybody for coming out here. You already heard a little spiel from me already, but I'm in the Department of Chemistry here, and so our goal is to figure out better chemical pathways by which we can remove carbon dioxide from these hard to abate sectors, like Grishma referred to, and also directly from air. What I usually say is that for a lot of these post-combustion carbon capture and direct air capture, we rely on basically a century-old technology to do this, using molecules that are called amines that can really selectively pull CO2, carbon dioxide, out of these streams, but they're very prone to degradation, especially by oxygen, which is, of course, one of the major components of air. And so we're trying to use essentially air-sensitive materials to pull CO2 out of the air. And so, you know, that really compromises the long-term stability of these materials and things like that. So our kind of running tenet in our group has been, how do we come up with fundamentally new chemistry by which we can selectively remove carbon dioxide from these kinds of streams? One of the big areas we have researched in is to switch from these amines, which are based on nitrogen, to oxygen-based nucleophiles. Actually, very similar to the work that Grishma does with what we call hydroxides, and embedding these into porous sponges. We've been able to embed them into different kinds of materials, including even charcoal, essentially, and been able to make materials that can pull CO2 out of the air and are much more oxidatively stable. But, and also we've made some other kind of molecules that operate in a similar way. But something we've really been interested in as well is the way you traditionally do carbon capture is you flow the stream over some sort of absorbent, or what we call a material that can pull the gas out at low temperature, and then you have to heat it up to very high temperatures, sometimes over 900 degrees Celsius, to release the CO2. And that's most of the energy cost of carbon capture. That's why we can't really do it on massive scale right now. And so we've been trying to think about how do we replace that high temperature heating step with other ways of putting the energy in. So something we're really excited about that we've been doing is actually using solar light to drive directly a carbon capture and release process, where we can actually essentially run it without having to do any energy input. It's just from the sun can actually pull CO2. And for that, we did use samples of the flue gas from Cornell's power plant, so it did work with that. So I think there's a lot of room to think about. I think we needed to be doing carbon capture about 30 years ago. We really need to get started now. But we also have to think about, the technologies we have now have significant limitations. So what can we do fundamentally to improve those technologies for the next generation, to do this really sustainably for the next, few centuries? That's what we really think about. That pretty much covers what we have done in the space of carbon dioxide capture. And again, if anybody has questions or would like to learn more, feel free to email me or come find me after this is over. Thanks.
Thank you.
You're doing next? Yeah. Okay, cool. Hi, I'm Tobias Hamrick. I'm on the faculty in chemical engineering. I usually like to try to start out with the why, right? So one question is why Cornell? Why Cornell? And one of the reasons for that you can see on the slide on the right is the people, right? The exceptionally talented and driven students and faculty and colleagues that you get to work with, the sort of resources in terms of characterization in the capture lab and support from the Atkinson Center and things like that, that make, I think, a pretty compelling place for why this is the place to do this type of research. So what's shown in the slide on the right as an example is something that started in the basement of Olin Hall, which is where my lab is located. As sort of a tiny prototype photothermal-chemical reactor, and then we went through some technology transfer and commercialization competitions, and it's now been transferred as a startup company, Dimensional Energy, that is engaged in converting CO2 into sustainable aviation fuels. I can't talk much about the details of it in the time now. I'm happy to talk more about it later if you're interested. The other important why is from a personal perspective. To put some of the numbers that Ben talked about earlier in perspective, when my grandpa was young, so a little over 100 years ago, CO2 levels were around 300 parts per million. When I was young, not quite 100 years ago, but let's say sometime around the 80s, CO2 levels were at 340 ppm. Today, they're at 425 ppm. And that's in the span of 2 generations. So I think there's a lot of reason to be worried about what will this look like in 2 generations from now, right? You can think about people in your family who would be impacted by that. And to me personally, that's a really compelling driver. If I sit down someday and have my grandkids ask me, what did you do, or what didn't you do, to have a compelling answer for that. Right? So that's I think a pretty strong personal motivation for this. But the other thing that's absolutely critical in this is to put some of the numbers that Ben mentioned in context, right? It's a huge challenge to remove all of this CO2. And I think one of the things that we have to be very clear-eyed about is no matter how cool your technology might be, or no matter how enthusiastic you might be about, I'm really committed to doing this. Unless it generates value, it's not going to happen. Not at this scale, right? So that introduces the question of who benefits. Who benefits from high CO2 levels? All you have to do for that is look outside. Everything that you see outside that is green benefits from high CO2 levels, right? So in a greenhouse, you artificially have higher CO2 levels because you have faster growth under those conditions. So I'm not, just to be clear, I'm not advocating that we plant trees everywhere. That's certainly a component of it, but for us rather in a sense of that as an inspiration for technology development and for how to approach this kind of science, right? So both from a system level perspective, if you think about how those things, those green things outside are designed in their sort of modular design characteristics and adaptable to a wide range of different environments, I think that has a lot of merit. Obviously successful technology in that sense, but also from a molecular perspective. If you think about how nature does this, of converting CO2 into value, the way nature approaches catalysis is very different than the way we as humans approach catalysis. But if you think about the catalytic converter that's on your car, if it's an ICE, not an EV, it's essentially, here's a piece of metal, and some gas flows over it, but the metal does nothing other than just being there. If you contrast that to how nature does catalysis, it's very different. Things are sort of squishy, things move around, so there's a dynamic component. The catalyst itself moves around a bit, and the catalyst has much more complex structure than just a lot of platinum or sort of fancy metals in your catalytic converter. So we're trying to adopt those principles and do these sort of chemical conversions of CO2 into something valuable, but using something that we arguably as a species are better at than nature in terms of manipulating, and that is electricity or electrons in general, right? So trying to do things that nature hasn't yet had an opportunity to optimize. So this is an example of doing it photochemically, essentially using light directly as an input, which is great. The challenge is it doesn't work so well at night, unless you run it by an LED, but in that case you have electricity as an input anyway. So we're trying to do essentially electrocatalysis, nature-inspired electrocatalysis in these types of systems where you have hierarchical structures that look very similar to the sort of main elements that you have in a natural leaf. But in a natural leaf, from a chemical engineering perspective, you would look at it and say, you have to get gas transport in, the CO2, you have to get light in, you have to get liquid to flow around, and all of this has to work defect tolerant at many different length scales, right? So those sort of design principles is what we're trying to do, but with an electrolyzer technology that is in many ways similar to what you would have in a hydrogen fuel cell, right? Where you essentially arrange your components at different length scales and then activate them also with different time profiles similar to what nature would do in a leaf outside, right? So that's what's happening in the lab. And then as Phil mentioned, a critical translational aspect of it is to say, does this actually work? Does this work at scale? It's one thing to write a paper on it and say, here's a great electrochemical reactor and it works under these conditions and it's better than whatever our competitors might be doing out there, and you advance the field a little bit. But to translate it from the lab to the quote-unquote real world, a critical aspect is to demonstrate, does it actually work if you feed it not CO2 from an ultra-high purity cylinder, but CO2 from a power plant, for example. Right? So the ability to walk over, literally walk over, and set up your electrolyzer, whatever your technology is there, and run it with flue gas is a critical unmet need. And as Phil said, there is no other place in the world that has that, especially at this scale, right? If you can go to places, a setup, for example, in Canada and other places, but that's at much larger scales. So there's a scale gap from having interesting technology that's developed in the lab to then being able to demonstrate that yes, it works with flue gas, yes, it works under these conditions. That's absolutely critical to translate that and to also attract support from DOE and ARPA-E and private sector and other investors to really move this forward and to really have impact and to do that now. So I think it's a wonderful platform. We don't have it set up yet, but hopefully at next year's reunion we can include that as a tour, walk over to the power plant, and you can see the capture lab there. So lots of details in there that I'm happy to talk more about if anyone's interested, but I'll stop here.
We actually, can you hear me? No, okay. So we do have some time set aside for any questions or thoughts that this panel brings up, and would love to open this up to the room. Yeah, sir.
Yeah.
And please introduce yourself and class year and what you're all about. Yeah.
I worked in the coal industry my entire career, and I was wondering if you wanted to bring back the coal-fired power plant here at Cornell,
I guess I can address that. Which is probably to say no. But, so in the US, CO2 emissions from burning natural gas have already surpassed that from burning coal, because the US is part of a huge switchover from coal to natural gas. So I believe this is projected worldwide that natural gas will overtake coal some point in the 2030s. It is wild that right now the biggest source of CO2 emissions in the world still is burning coal, even though we think of it, maybe, we don't really use it as much in the US. So that's why I think, coal is a great one, that if we can do it, that's what a lot of people have focused on, and I think, well, where we should absolutely start there. But natural gas is kind of the one that we're going to probably have for a lot longer, I feel like. And it's actually a more difficult separation as well. The natural gas combustion produces less carbon dioxide, which already makes it better for climate change risk. But the reason why is that there's a lower partial pressure of CO2 in the stream, which is good for that reason, but it actually makes it more difficult to pull it out. So that's where we really need to start pushing technologies to that more challenging. It's actually closer, I would say, when you start to get into the air challenge too. That's an order of magnitude harder, but very dilute carbon dioxide from natural gas emissions and from air. So that's kind of been our motivation why we focused on things like natural gas, and then cement and steel are not going away. In the US, coal is sort of tapering off a bit. But one thing to think about in the world is, I think something like 90% of energy in China is from burning coal. So we're still going to need to do it because they don't have natural gas resources really at all. So I think that's why we get into this thing, like I think Ben said, we need many solutions. There's not one size fits all. In the US, we can do this, but in China, they can't do that, and in Europe, they can't do that, or in Africa, or whatever, right? So we need a lot of solutions that can be deployed all over to tackle this huge challenge. Yeah. Sorry, really long answer.
The other question is, what is the current cost per ton of carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere, from the air?
You might know the answer to this better than me.
So the DOE has a target for direct air capture of CO2, and they are very supportive of advanced technologies that cost $100 or less. So they consider that to be the cutoff point, $100. So if you have a technology that can remove CO2 and costs $100 or less, they consider that to be viable. Now, in terms of where certain companies are in the technology development cycle, most companies are in the range of about $300 to $400 per ton of CO2 removed, right? So they need to bring their costs down at least 3 to 4 times compared to what their costs are right now. So there's an enormous amount of technology development that needs to go in to make that happen.
Yeah, David.
To follow up on your observations about China, what's the carbon generation of, say, India, which was now bigger than China, much younger? Is their technology significantly different in that regard?
I believe India is also very dominated by coal as well. It's just, we are very lucky, I mean, the whole shale gas revolution that happened in the US, to have realized that we actually had a ton of, fossil fuel that's a little bit less bad than coal. I want to be careful to say that. It's good, but it is better than coal. So I think that both India and China, they are increasingly dominated by coal. And it's much more difficult for them to do the switchover that the US is kind of doing right now from coal to natural gas because they don't have the same resources. So I think, I have been part of collaborative projects in the past to think about carbon capture from power plants with universities in China, and they're pretty set on, they're very focused on coal because of that, and I think the same is true in India as well. Yeah.
I can add 2 cents to that. So here in the US, there's a lot of interest, of course, in shale gas for obvious reasons, but then there's also an interest in what one can do with coal, other than using it as an energy resource, right? So now there's a lot of money coming from DOE in reimagining turning coal into other solid products such as graphite or graphite carbon. So if we can do that, we can actually use the graphite carbon as an input into batteries, right? And not rely on mined graphite. So there is this whole new set of technologies that are being promoted from within DOE to turn coal into other solid carbon products. And in fact, my group we just filed a patent on turning carbonaceous resources, including biomass and coal, into porous graphite carbon, so that way we can use that as an input in battery materials. And if you look at it from a societal perspective, it makes sense, right? So there's a lot of communities that work in the coal industry, have a legacy of working in the coal industry, and now if they abandon that industry, what else are they going to do? How do we reimagine societies so they can make a living? So now reimagining the way we can turn coal into other products that don't generate greenhouse gases, but are still needed for the energy transition, is something that is catching on in a big way, particularly here in the US, but one can make that translational argument in places like India too, right? And not only is India rich in coal, but it's also one of the largest producers of iron and steel, which is a part to it, right? So how can we now get away from coal, from burning coal more specifically, but instead try and harness coal to produce other high-value products that we need to.
I've noticed you talk a lot about building value-added products from carbon capture. Is that usually the approach that you're taking? Otherwise, who pays for it? Talking about how do we get it to be scalable? Your ideas of value-added products are brilliant because you're taking something awful and turning it into something positive.
I think that's just, I mean, fundamentally, so there's a sort of thing that could happen at a university campus where there's great fundamental science and some engineering, but ultimately, for it to have any traction impact outside, it has to work economically. But it has to generate value. Otherwise, the sort of things that can run through optimism and incentives are limited, and it's not to address challenges at that scale. So it has to generate value, and it has to close the carbon cycle the same way that nature essentially does it. Right? They look at CO2 as a valuable input, and for them the value generated is internally. I think we can use those sort of design principles both from a system level perspective as well as at sort of smaller scale.
I'm Short, civil engineer, and I work in construction chemistry engineer. I think there's a basic element of the science here that I'm not understanding, which is that the reason we burn fossil fuels is because they're releasing tremendous amount of energy and sort of producing carbon dioxide at a very low energy state. And we're talking about wanting to take that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, turn it back into something solid. But it's already in such a low energy state. How do you turn it into something solid without adding a tremendous amount of energy? You might be able to do that if you're like a plant, dealing with like, I have this much sunlight and this much oxygen. But when you're trying to capture out of the waste stream of a power plant, there's a lot of carbon dioxide you need to capture, and you don't have, where's the energy?
That's a great question. And that's why we do what we do, right? Hard problem to solve. So you're absolutely right. CO2, the carbon form in CO2 is in its most oxidized state. It has no electrons to give, right? So what do you do with that material? So there's a couple of ways we can turn it into an even lower thermodynamic state. And that lower thermodynamic state is that of the calcium carbonate or magnesium carbonate. And that's why nature, calcium carbonate or magnesium carbonate. So that's why if you leave a lime solution out on a day like this, it's slowly going to start turning into a calcium carbonate because it's a thermodynamically downhill after nature does that. We just try to make it go faster.
I mean, you're talking about gigaton scales,
Right.
gigatons of calcium, magnesium,
So what are we going to do with
yeah,
it?
how do you get it? Where do you get it from?
I can give another example in terms of, so you're right as far as, if you think about it in terms of fuel has a high energy content and CO2 has a low energy content, and then you can find materials in it with even lower content. But as far as how do you get the CO2 from here back up there in terms of energy content, you can do that with renewables. And in fact, you can think about it, CO2 as a feedstock for, as a medium for energy storage, which is exactly what those green things are doing.
Yeah.
Right? They use the CO2, use renewables as an input, and then undergo chemical transformation, and then store that energy. Exactly. So in their case, it's some sort of, not to be disrespectful, but in the plant's case, it's essentially it's a chemical conversion into something that for that cycle works. But for us, we can do the same thing. You can store. In fact, you can use CO2 as a medium. If you have, for example, renewables that would otherwise be stranded, use those renewables to transform CO2 into a liquid product and then store it. One of the examples would be, and this is especially relevant for New York State agricultural facilities, biogas. It's about 50-50 CO2 and methane. Methane, incidentally, is about 50 times worse than CO2 in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So one thing is if you take this manure and just, you get greenhouse gas emissions from that. Or you can take the biogas, methane and CO2, electrochemically convert that, generate value for the farms into methanol, just as an example, as a liquid product. And then you basically have renewable energy that would otherwise be lost, stored in the form of chemical energy.
That's we're 15% renewable now, and instead of sticking to 100%, because of people at 150%. So we have excess energy that we then use to pull the carbon out of the house.
Not
might be doable.
Yeah, no, I'm not going that far. I'm thinking more in the sense of even for currently installed renewables. If and there's that situation is already happening here as well as in Europe, where we have excess generating capacity. Right? If supply exceeds demand, that gets lost unless you have energy storage. And you could say, yeah, we're just going to install a whole bunch of lithium-ion batteries. It's just not cost effective.
One solution going on right now, I work in solar, and we use something called virtual power plants in order where we have residential solar all around the country that's linked together via software. And in doing that, we're able to take that excess energy from the home, send it back to the grid. Cities in California have actually downgraded their coal-fired or other power plants as a result of that by linking renewables, like I said.
Go back there.
I'm John Sri Morales, Conservation Board. Can I hear your elevator speech to a critic of carbon capture and storage in terms of it being a technology viewed by some as deflecting and delaying stronger action on climate?
Yeah, I guess I can kind of respond to that. So I think it's there's two sides to it. So just so everybody knows what we're talking about, there are many who say we should not do carbon capture and sequestration from fossil fuel fired power plants because it's a distraction from the energy transition, and that we should just go all in on, for example, for air capture and renewables, which I understand. I think that when you look at in the depth of the projections people have made, like IPCC and other experts, if you want to reach the goals of the Paris Accord, which we are already pretty close to failing, honestly, probably by 2030 we will have gone past 1.5C, which is we're supposed to do that by 2100, so 7 years early. We cannot switch energy sources over quickly enough. So you can let those power plants just keep burning, and it will make it much worse than if we do post-combustion capture and abate some of that over the next 7 years as we transition away from all fossil fuels. The second thing I will say, it's come up a few times here, and is there are still sectors that produce carbon you will never get rid of, or it's very difficult to imagine how you would. Steel production, I think it's like 10 or 20% of CO2 emissions. Cement, these are things that produce a lot of carbon dioxide, and they are not going away by 2100, right? I don't know what we're going to make buildings out of, if not cement and concrete, right?
So, for 30 years,
yeah, we've been, so I think that
that's the actual physical process of doing the capture and all these things we're talking about what to do with the CO2, it works, the fundamental concept is the same for those sectors as it is for power plants. So there's a lot of synergy there too. So that's kind of what my motivation is, just really holding to the, I wish we could switch completely to renewable tomorrow, but it's not gonna happen, and it's definitely not gonna happen in a lot of the world. The US may be on a faster track to do it, but in some places of the world they're nowhere near close to the high renewable percentage we have. So that's why I think we should have been doing post-combustion capture all along, but now we have to pay kind of for the sins of the past, right? So we have to be doing it, and there are now rules in place. The US is going to start trying to do it on new natural gas power plants, for example. So I think that's kind of the motivator there. I guess my feeling is, and maybe it's been a theme of today, we need there's not one solution to climate change. There's going to be 100 solutions. We need to be multifaceted. We need to stop emitting from all the industrial sectors, which fossil fuel combustion, steel, cement are the big ones. Transportation is another big one. We need to switch, we need better energy storage. That's kind of what Tobias was referring to, right? Like we need better energy storage, grid storage, better renewables. All of this is going to be needed together to move this forward. So I guess that's my philosophy.
And one thing I'd add, just as a sort of university-wide point of view, we support and cultivate a really wide range of faculty with lots of different technological interests and with really different points of view on this question. And something I love working about at Cornell is there's all these really thoughtful, interesting people, many of whom really disagree with each other about the best ways of going about this. But we are sort of in the business of cultivating this academic atmosphere of all these smart people trying to grapple with this really big and tough challenge. I just want to double check our time. How are we doing, Sean? Good.
10 minutes?
10 more minutes. Okay, great. Yeah, right here.
Kind of on a similar note, I was kind of curious about beyond Cornell and looking at the network of universities. How does coordinating solving each of these pieces of the problem work? Is there some higher body that goes to all the universities? Hey, these universities have these people working on this. These will have this one working on this. Try and coordinate so that not everyone's just living in isolated silos.
I think you have hit on one of the great pieces of academia. We try, and of course, probably all of us have collaborators at other universities, but that's on an individual basis. Academia is not the best at all coordinating together to try to solve a challenge. It's something that would be great to try to address, but I would say, only as directed maybe by funding availabilities and things can kind of push everybody in a certain direction. But it's difficult to get two universities to team up. I think maybe
well, there isn't a formal structure for collaboration, but every once in a while there are center-like grants, and we've written a couple, with Bill and myself. The Capture Lab is another example that brought the three of us together within an institution. But then there are funding opportunities that are that actually require us to bring in collaborators from other institutions. And one of the examples in the context is that most of the Department of Energy grants that we need to put in actually require us to partner with a minority-serving institution in the interest of actually developing and cultivating the next generation workforce. Right? So these forced collaborations, if you would, are really intended to help us diversify the workforce, if you will, in the area of not just carbon management, but also in the wider area of energy and resource conversion and recovery and the like.
Just one thing to add to that. In principle, there's an overarching entity, so things like the Department of Energy that would say, we're going to support this center focusing on that, this center focusing on something else. From their perspective, they avoid duplication. You don't want to have every university focuses on lithium-ion batteries. So there's some overarching organization in that sense. But the other thing to add to that is there needs to be just sort of basic scientific progress always relies on reproducing. Right? So not exactly duplicating, but some of it has to be part of progresses. Reproducibility.
So what are your thoughts on the advantages and disadvantages of, once you've captured the carbon, storing it somehow versus using it somehow?
take a stab at that question. So we live in a carbon economy, right? We are carbon life forms. Carbon is everywhere. And so there is a huge demand for carbon-based products. When I say carbon-based products, it is graphite for batteries, fuels, carbonates, you name it. We need a lot of carbon to keep our life going, both from a fuel standpoint, but also from a quantity standpoint. So that is the utilization segment, right? And it basically runs on an economic cycle. I produce it, somebody pays for it, that helps me support a business and keeps the economic cycle going and meets a critical need in the world. And then there is this other aspect that we produce so much more CO2 than what we can actually convert. So what do we do with all of that? So to that end, especially in the southern parts of the United States, like in places like Texas, Louisiana, they have these vast geologic formations where people have basically concluded that it's safe to actually store CO2 and lock that CO2 away. So we need both. We need to keep the carbon economy running, and we also need to store that CO2 in geologic formation. The challenge with geological storage is that it's cheap to do, just stick the CO2 underground, but it's challenging to monitor it over the course of 100, 200 years. You need to put sensors down, you need to collect the data on the pressure dissipation, put that into a risk model, and then assess if this geologic reservoir is actually compliant with the risk standards that the community expects. So there's a lot of
historical data on that.
What's that?
We've been burying plastics in the ground for a couple of years now.
Yes, we've been burying many things. We put a lot of dirty water in the subsurface environment, right, just for pressure management. The only difference is that we put pressurized CO2. Right? And the bigger concern is that enabling this solution will actually, as was mentioned earlier, distract us from developing other climate solutions. So there tends to be pushback. But for the most part, there is abundance of literature. DOE has now funded close to $1 billion+ in actually establishing the feasibility of geologic carbon storage. There is data to support the environments where this works and also environments where this doesn't work. So there's a lot of literature in this space.
Can we do a fact check or a level set on the politicians are, of course, throwing all these terms around for decarbonization and somehow holding it up as something, if we just believe in it, it's going to take care of itself. And you're laying out very clearly the scalability issue. We've got to make sure the technology works and then build it up to scale. What are realistic expectations of what we can do? And we have this arc of trying to reverse what we're currently involved is. What should we believe? What's out there that we can all hang our heads on? Or make sure you get more funding to do the things that really matter?
Isn't that part of what David Lodge is doing in Washington right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, Faye, do you want to? Oh, 5 minutes. 5 minutes, yeah. I mean, I spent 8 years in the New York City Mayor's office, culminating as the director of the Office of Climate and Sustainability. And so I think a lot about the relationship between the goals politicians set, the feasibility of achieving those goals, and the roles of different institutions across the United States to helping us tackle this incredibly challenging problem. One reason I've got very excited about coming to a place like Cornell is because before decisions even reach politicians or businesses, people need to fundamentally understand how hard it will be to make these transitions. So a politician can pass a law to make everybody do something, but they're not going to be reelected if it's not an easy or attractive thing to do, and that rule is going to get reversed as soon as they come in. So the notion of all of America's scientific resources and technological developers coming together to identify lower cost ways of making the transition and also accelerate the transitions that are currently cost effective, and I think there are a lot of them out there. I personally am like cautiously optimistic. I like reading history, and I know that humanity has always sort of faced major challenges in every generation, and this is kind of our big challenge. It's not, I still probably rather live now than in most other times in human existence. I wouldn't know how to text my friends in most other times in human existence. But that's sort of the role of we in the university and policymakers to try to go as far and as fast as we can to try to tackle this. So that's not a really precise answer to your question, but that's sort of my general cautious optimism about this whole really challenging endeavor. Yeah.
Just one quick comment. I was from Cornell Civil Engineering, 1969.
Whoop, whoop.
You touched a little bit on it right at the end. One of the things that's really going to be required for this is measurement, reporting, and verification systems. We need a way, an agreed way of understanding how much carbon you're taking out, what the energy costs associated with doing it is, and the climate convention is still struggling to come up with, I think it's Article 6 or something like that will allow for measurement of all these things across the entire value chain, not just how much pressure there is on the ground and soil, but across everything. And that's really, really critical to getting, understanding what we're doing and getting the public to accept the results.
I completely agree with that. I mean, if you don't have MRV, so let's just say I'm in the business of generating carbon removal credits, right? And somebody is only going to pay me to the extent that the carbon that I've removed is monitored and is verified, and how much of it is quantified as well as its permanence. And there are some solutions that people are talking about these days, right? Like distributing rock in soils, and some of these are easy to implement, but the MRV is challenging. With a set of solutions that Phil, Tobias, and I are working on, the engineering is challenging, but the MRV is easy, right? Because once we've captured it, we can go and measure it directly. These are engineered systems. So that is really, I would say, the distinguishing factor between natural solutions for managing carbon, where it's cheaper to implement a solution. It's easy to grow the tree, but how do you verify how it's going to degrade and what's going to happen to carbon? Versus with our solutions, where the engineering is a challenge, but the MRV is super simple. So it's so these are real challenges, and there are companies that are coming up with ways of doing MRV to support this, I would say, this growing ecosystem around carbon management.
One last comment, 10 seconds. I completely agree with what I think I've heard every one of you say, is we need not just 100 solutions, we need 1,000. We scale this problem is so big that you can't rely on one thing. I mean, one thing, whatever it is good, but you're going to need hundreds of ways to capture, recycle, reuse, store, reduce, all of those things put together. It's going to be real critical. And so having the Atkinson Center for Sustainability looking at different things is really a great idea.
Yeah, the very easy solution, or explanation I give to what you just said, you can't have one solution to this is, solar is not really going to work very well in Ithaca, New York. Right? You can't just say, make Cornell completely solar, right? Then now it's, the sun never shines here. Or sometimes, you could manage it, right? But we need, many solutions, right? Things like geothermal and stuff like that. So I totally agree that we need many solutions that will work all over the world.
Thank you.
That's a great final sentiment. So thank you everyone for being here.